Hollywood has a way of rewarding brilliance while quietly extracting something far more intimate in return, and few lives illustrate that exchange more painfully than the life of Meryl Streep. Long before she became a symbol of artistic integrity or a benchmark against which generations of actors would be measured, there was a woman standing at the edge of extraordinary loss while the world was just beginning to applaud her talent. The tragedy attached to her name is not loud, not explosive, and not easily reduced to a single scandal or headline. It is slow, accumulative, and deeply human, unfolding in quiet rooms and hospital corridors while cameras waited elsewhere. At the height of her early promise, when opportunity finally aligned with preparation, her private life was collapsing under a weight no amount of acclaim could relieve. She did not step into fame unscarred. She arrived already wounded, carrying grief that would shape every role she ever touched. As a young actress in New York, she was disciplined, observant, and inward-looking, rarely the loudest presence in the room, but always the most attentive. That attentiveness was not just craft, it was survival. She had learned early that silence could be protective, that control could be a refuge, and that love, once found, could also be taken away without warning. When she met John Cazale, she did not fall for an image or a future, but for a fellow artist who understood the gravity of work and the fragility of time. Their relationship unfolded away from publicity, grounded in rehearsals, shared scripts, and long conversations that did not need witnesses. But just as her career began to open doors that had once seemed unreachable, illness entered the room and refused to leave. Cancer did not negotiate with ambition or timing. It demanded everything immediately. While others celebrated her emerging success, she was navigating production schedules around chemotherapy, pleading with directors to keep the man she loved employed so he could work until the end, not for prestige, but for dignity. She took roles not because they advanced her image, but because they paid medical bills. At night, she memorized lines beside a hospital bed, learning how to hold composure while watching someone disappear in fragments. When John Cazale died, the loss did not happen in isolation from her career, it happened inside it, braided into performances the audience would later praise for their restraint and depth, never fully realizing where that gravity came from. She collapsed against his chest, begging him to stay, and when he was gone, something essential in her understanding of love and permanence was gone with him. Yet the industry did not pause. Films were released, awards were scheduled, expectations mounted. She returned to sets with a face trained to remain still, channeling devastation into precision, sorrow into focus. This was the origin of the quiet intensity audiences would later revere, the reason her characters seemed to carry histories that extended beyond the frame. The tragedy was not that she suffered loss, but that she had to learn how to keep functioning while the world interpreted her composure as strength rather than necessity. Even as recognition grew, she remained wary of sentimentality, allergic to excess, committed to work not as escape but as structure. She did not perform grief publicly. She folded it inward, allowing it to inform her choices without consuming her. Hollywood crowned her again and again, yet the crown never replaced what had been taken. It simply rested on a woman who understood, earlier than most, that brilliance does not shield you from pain, and that survival often looks like discipline rather than resilience. The heartbreak that defines her story is not a single moment frozen in time, but a condition, a long apprenticeship in loss that taught her how to stand still under pressure and speak softly in a world addicted to noise. And perhaps that is why, decades later, audiences sense something unspoken in her presence, a gravity that cannot be taught or replicated, only endured. The woman the world would later revere as Meryl Streep did not grow up believing she was destined for anything extraordinary. Her childhood in Summit, New Jersey unfolded inside a stable, orderly household where expectations were modest and emotions were carefully managed. Her father valued discipline and achievement. Her mother carried unrealized artistic dreams that hovered quietly in the background, never fully spoken but deeply felt. It was a home where encouragement existed, yet praise was measured, and that balance instilled in her an early habit of self-observation. She learned to watch before she spoke, to listen before she acted, and to question herself more harshly than anyone else ever would. That inward gaze became her earliest training, long before any formal education ever began. As a teenager, she sensed a vague dissatisfaction she could not name. Life was comfortable, predictable, and safe, yet something essential felt muted. Music became her first attempt at escape. Formal vocal training offered discipline and focus, a place where effort translated into tangible progress. She learned control, breath, and precision, skills that would later define her acting, but at the time simply gave her something to hold on to. When she stepped onto a stage for the first time in high school, the experience surprised her. Instead of fear, she felt clarity. Instead of nerves, she felt relief. The stage did not amplify her anxieties, it absorbed them. For the first time, she understood what it meant to inhabit a space fully, without apology, and that sensation lodged itself deep within her sense of identity. Her path forward was cautious rather than ambitious. She enrolled at Vassar College with the intention of studying costume design, choosing proximity to performance without fully committing to it. Acting still felt like something to approach carefully, almost with suspicion. Yet talent has a way of revealing itself despite hesitation. When she auditioned for a demanding theatrical role at the urging of a professor, the response was immediate and undeniable. That single performance altered how others saw her, and more importantly, how she began to see herself. The invitation to apply to the Yale School of Drama followed, and with it came a shift from quiet curiosity to rigorous self-testing. Yale was not a sanctuary. It was an arena. Surrounded by confident, expressive classmates, she often appeared reserved by comparison, more analytical than flamboyant. Some instructors questioned her emotional accessibility, mistaking restraint for limitation. She absorbed those critiques without protest, internalizing them not as discouragement but as fuel. While others pushed outward, she refined inward. She studied accents obsessively, observed human behavior with almost forensic attention, and practiced until technique became instinct. Yale did not crown her a prodigy, but it forged her patience, teaching her that mastery could be built slowly and invisibly. When she entered the professional theater world, she carried that discipline with her. Early Broadway work did not bring instant fame, but it earned something more durable, respect from those who recognized emotional accuracy when they saw it. Her performances were notable not for grand gestures, but for restraint, for the way she allowed silence to do as much work as dialogue. Casting directors began to notice that she could anchor a scene without dominating it, a rare quality in an industry that often rewarded excess. Film followed quietly. Small roles, limited screen time, and supporting characters introduced her to a wider audience without defining her too narrowly. Even then, she resisted the temptation to simplify herself for visibility. She did not chase likability or glamour. Instead, she approached each role as a problem to be solved, a life to be understood from the inside out. That commitment to internal truth over surface appeal set her apart, even before the public fully realized what they were witnessing. Parallel to her professional development, her personal life was evolving in ways that would profoundly shape her worldview. She fell in love not with spectacle, but with familiarity and depth, with someone whose relationship to art mirrored her own seriousness. Their shared life was modest, private, and intensely focused on work. There were no grand declarations, only shared routines and mutual respect. That grounded connection reinforced her belief that meaning was built quietly, not announced. As her career gained momentum, she began to experience the first hints of public scrutiny, the subtle shift in how rooms reacted to her presence. Yet she remained largely unchanged, skeptical of praise and wary of labels. She understood instinctively that attention could be fleeting, that validation was unreliable, and that craft was the only stable foundation she could trust. This mindset insulated her from early fame, but also isolated her, reinforcing the habit of emotional self-containment she had practiced since childhood. The tension between her rising profile and her private instincts created a dual existence that would persist throughout her life. On one side stood an actress accumulating opportunities, accolades, and expectations. On the other stood a woman who guarded her inner world fiercely, reluctant to let the noise of success intrude upon the discipline she relied on to function. That divide was not accidental. It was protective. It allowed her to keep working, keep learning, and keep evolving without becoming consumed by the very industry that was elevating her. By the time audiences began to recognize her name, the foundations of her identity were already firmly set. She was not chasing greatness. She was constructing durability. Every choice reflected a belief that longevity mattered more than momentum, and that depth would outlast novelty. This philosophy, shaped by a childhood of quiet observation, years of disciplined training, and an early commitment to privacy, positioned her uniquely for what lay ahead. The tragedies, controversies, and moral storms that would later surround her did not find her unprepared. They found a woman already practiced in endurance, already accustomed to holding complexity without explanation, and already aware that survival, in any meaningful sense, required far more than talent alone. The turning point that fused Meryl Streep's past discipline with the harshest realities of fame did not arrive as a single explosion, but as a convergence of pressures that tested every belief she held about work, loyalty, and moral responsibility. By the time she reached the height of her authority in Hollywood, she was no longer just an actress delivering performances. She had become a symbol, a moral reference point in an industry increasingly judged not only by talent, but by conscience. And it was precisely that symbolic status that made the storms she faced so devastating. The world did not merely watch her work. It scrutinized her silence, her timing, her words, and even her pauses, measuring them against an ideal that no human being could realistically sustain. The most destabilizing moment came when the long-buried abuses of Harvey Weinstein surfaced publicly. For decades, Weinstein had been one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood, shaping careers, controlling distribution, and cultivating an image of the ruthless but indispensable producer. Streep had worked with him, most notably on The Iron Lady, a role that earned her an Academy Award and further cemented her reputation for transformative excellence. When the allegations broke in 2017, the industry convulsed. Statements were demanded. Silence was interpreted as complicity. Speed became a test of virtue. Streep responded quickly, condemning Weinstein's actions as disgraceful and praising the women who came forward. Yet the response, intended as clarity, became the beginning of a far more complicated reckoning. Criticism did not come from anonymous commentators alone. It came from within the movement itself. Rose McGowan, one of Weinstein's most vocal accusers, accused Streep of knowing and choosing silence, framing her as an emblem of elite hypocrisy. The accusation cut deeper than any tabloid headline because it challenged the very foundation of Streep's public identity. She had built a career on empathy, on understanding women's interior lives, on advocating for representation and respect. To be accused of willful blindness was not merely an attack on her reputation. It was an attack on her character. The debate that followed was merciless. Some defended her, arguing that Weinstein's power depended precisely on concealment and fear. Others asked how someone so perceptive, so intelligent, could have remained unaware. As the controversy escalated, past remarks were dragged into the light. A joking comment from a Golden Globe speech in which she had referred to Weinstein as a god resurfaced, stripped of context and weaponized. Another professional remark describing him as respectful during their work together was cited by his legal team, a grotesque inversion of intent that left her furious and defensive. She responded publicly, clarifying that her words had been distorted and insisting that abuse was the sole responsibility of the abuser, regardless of professional history. But in the post-Me Too climate, explanation often mattered less than alignment. The public wanted certainty, not nuance. For Streep, this moment represented a collision between her lifelong instincts and the demands of a new moral order. She had always believed in addressing conflict through work rather than spectacle, through private resolve rather than public confrontation. Hollywood, however, was no longer operating by those rules. Silence was no longer neutral. It was suspect. And for perhaps the first time in her career, Streep found herself on the defensive, her intentions dissected by strangers who felt entitled to a moral accounting. Posters appeared in Los Angeles depicting her alongside Weinstein, her eyes obscured by a red bar reading she knew. It was a visceral image, one that reduced decades of complexity into a single accusation that could not easily be disproven. This was not a scandal she could outgrow by choosing better roles or retreating into craft. It followed her into interviews, award conversations, and online discourse. Even those who defended her did so cautiously, acknowledging that proximity to power always carries ethical risk. Streep herself acknowledged the pain of the moment without conceding guilt, insisting she had not colluded, had not known, and had never condoned harm. She spoke of the system rather than the individual, of an industry built on silence and fear, where truth was often buried beneath contracts and consequences. Yet the damage was already done, not in a legal sense, but in the erosion of an image once considered untouchable. As if that moral crisis were not enough, another controversy erupted from an entirely different direction, revealing how even seemingly trivial matters could become symbolic battlegrounds. In 2017, fashion icon Karl Lagerfeld accused Streep of commissioning a Chanel gown and then canceling it after being offered payment by another designer. His remark, dismissive and cutting, framed her as mercenary and unprincipled. Streep denied the accusation outright, stating that she had never accepted payment to wear clothing on the red carpet and that such behavior violated her personal ethics. Chanel later suggested the incident was a misunderstanding, but the narrative had already escaped control. Once again, Streep found herself defending not an action, but an identity. These episodes exposed a deeper tension in her public life. She had become a symbol in an era that devoured symbols. Every gesture was interpreted as a statement, every absence as intent. The industry she had navigated for decades through discipline and restraint now demanded constant visibility and instantaneous alignment. For someone who valued privacy and deliberation, this environment was exhausting. Yet she did not retreat. Instead, she continued working, choosing roles that reflected complexity rather than certainty. She appeared in films and series that questioned systems, explored power, and highlighted moral ambiguity, as if using art itself as a response. Privately, the accumulation of scrutiny took its toll. Friends described her as reflective rather than embittered, saddened rather than angry. She did not lash out, nor did she attempt to rehabilitate her image through calculated publicity. Her approach remained consistent with the woman she had always been: work, family, and quiet persistence. The controversies did not break her, but they altered the way she was seen and perhaps the way she saw the world. She had learned early that grief could coexist with success. Now she learned that integrity could coexist with doubt, that being principled did not guarantee being believed. This period marked a shift from external achievement to internal reckoning. The applause continued. The roles remained plentiful, but the unquestioned reverence was gone. In its place stood something more fragile and more honest, a recognition that even the most respected figures are shaped by the systems they inhabit. For Streep, the tragedy was not condemnation or loss of status. It was the realization that in a culture hungry for absolutes, nuance could feel like guilt, and silence could feel like betrayal, even when born from habit rather than intent. And yet, through it all, she kept working, kept choosing complexity, and kept allowing her performances to speak where words could no longer suffice. The aftermath of those storms did not announce itself with dramatic collapse or public retreat, but with subtler consequences that unfolded slowly across Meryl Streep's inner and professional life. The controversies did not end her career, nor did they strip her of respect in any official sense. Awards continued, roles remained available, and directors still sought her presence. Yet something intangible shifted. The unquestioned moral authority that once surrounded her work gave way to a more complicated perception, one in which admiration coexisted with skepticism and reverence was tempered by doubt. This change did not come from verdicts or evidence, but from atmosphere, from the way conversations sounded different from the way praise arrived with caveats. Psychologically, the weight of scrutiny deepened a pattern she had carried since youth, the instinct to retreat inward and rely on discipline rather than reassurance. Friends and collaborators noticed that she became even more selective, not only about projects but about visibility itself. Interviews grew rarer, appearances more deliberate. She no longer felt compelled to clarify every accusation or correct every narrative. Instead, she allowed silence to resume its familiar role as a buffer, though now silence carried a different meaning in the public imagination. What had once been interpreted as dignity could now be read as distance. Yet for her, it remained the only way to preserve a sense of equilibrium. Emotionally, the period reinforced a truth she had learned decades earlier through loss, that endurance often demands a narrowing of focus. She concentrated on work that resonated with her values, stories that explored power, vulnerability, and moral ambiguity without offering easy resolutions. The roles she chose during this phase often reflected systems under strain, individuals navigating ethical gray zones, or women confronting the limits of authority. These characters did not redeem her image, nor were they meant to. They functioned as continuations of a lifelong inquiry into human complexity, allowing her to process turmoil through performance rather than declaration. Socially, the consequences extended beyond her own experience. Her situation became a reference point in broader conversations about accountability, complicity, and proximity to power. Commentators debated whether moral responsibility could exist without knowledge, whether silence itself constituted harm, and how much awareness could reasonably be expected of those operating within hierarchies designed to obscure truth. In these discussions, Streep was no longer just an individual. She was a symbol through which society examined its own expectations of conscience and courage. That symbolic burden was heavy, precisely because it stripped nuance from a life defined by it. The reaction from peers was measured and often private. Some expressed solidarity, understanding the impossibility of proving what one did not know. Others maintained distance, wary of being drawn into polarizing debates. The industry itself moved forward, eager to signal change while quietly preserving familiar structures. In that environment, Streep's choice to keep working without spectacle stood out as both resistance and resignation. She neither apologized for crimes she did not commit nor demanded absolution. She continued, trusting that time, rather than argument, would contextualize the moment. The toll of this sustained tension was not dramatic burnout, but cumulative fatigue. Carrying the expectations of moral exemplar alongside the demands of craft required constant calibration. Every public statement risked misinterpretation. Every absence invited speculation. For someone who had spent a lifetime honing precision, this loss of control over narrative was deeply unsettling. Yet she adapted, drawing on the same skills that had sustained her through earlier grief. Observation, restraint, patience. She understood that reputations, like performances, are shaped not by single moments, but by accumulation. Within her personal life, the period coincided with quiet transitions that further reinforced her desire for simplicity. Family remained her anchor, a space where roles were not evaluated and intentions did not require explanation. Away from cameras, she was not an icon or a case study. She was a mother, a partner, a listener. Those ordinary interactions provided grounding in a world that increasingly reduced individuals to symbols. They reminded her that worth was not contingent on consensus. Professionally, the controversies did not diminish her influence so much as recalibrate it. She was no longer positioned above critique, and perhaps she never truly was. Instead, she occupied a space more reflective of reality, admired but questioned, respected but scrutinized. That shift mirrored a broader cultural change, one that rejected untouchable figures in favor of collective accountability. For Streep, accepting that change meant relinquishing a certain kind of protection while retaining agency over her work. The long-term consequence of this period was not isolation, but a deepened seriousness about legacy. She became less interested in how she was perceived in the moment and more concerned with what her body of work might say over time. Roles were chosen for resonance rather than visibility, for substance rather than symbolism. She allowed the contradictions to stand, trusting audiences to find their own conclusions without her guidance. In doing so, she reaffirmed a belief that had guided her since the beginning, that art could hold complexity more honestly than public discourse ever could. Ultimately, the aftermath reshaped her relationship with both fame and silence. Fame lost its illusion of safety, revealing itself as conditional and volatile. Silence, once a refuge, became contested ground, yet she reclaimed it on her own terms. The consequences did not end her story, but they altered its tone, adding layers of gravity and introspection that would inform everything that followed. Through it all, she remained what she had always been, a woman shaped by loss, sustained by discipline, and committed to telling stories even when her own became harder to interpret. Behind the public narratives and carefully interpreted moments, there existed a quieter layer of Meryl Streep's life that rarely reached the surface, a series of small, almost invisible choices that revealed how she survived pressure without allowing it to harden her. These were not stories designed for interviews or award speeches. They lived in rehearsal rooms after everyone else had left, in handwritten notes tucked into scripts, in habits so ordinary they were easy to overlook. It was within these private spaces that her resilience was most clearly visible. Those who worked closely with her often spoke not of grandeur, but of preparation. She arrived earlier than required, stayed later than expected, and listened more than she spoke. Assistants recalled how she would sit quietly with a script, marking pauses not for emphasis but for breath, as if mapping where a character's fear or hesitation might live. Directors noticed that she asked fewer questions than most, but the questions she did ask were precise, sometimes unsettlingly so, focused not on motivation, but on consequence. What happens after this line? What does she lose here? These were not academic exercises. They reflected a mind trained by experience to look beyond immediate impact and toward emotional cost. There were moments, rarely documented, when her composure fractured slightly, not in public collapse, but in subtle withdrawal. Friends described evenings when she declined invitations, choosing instead to cook quietly at home, playing music low, avoiding conversation. This was not sadness in a dramatic sense. It was recalibration. She understood that too much exposure dulled sensitivity, and sensitivity was the core of her craft. Protecting it meant saying no far more often than she said yes. In an industry built on constant presence, the restraint was its own form of rebellion. One longtime collaborator recalled watching her rehearse a scene that required devastating emotional restraint. After multiple takes, each technically flawless, she asked for one more. This time, she did less. Fewer gestures, less visible strain. When the scene ended, the room was silent. She had removed every trace of performance until only truth remained. When asked why she changed it, she replied quietly that the character would not waste energy showing pain. Pain was something she had learned to carry, not display. Those words lingered long after filming ended, offering a glimpse into how deeply her personal history informed her artistic instincts. Away from sets, she maintained rituals that anchored her to normalcy. Gardening, long walks, handwritten letters to friends rather than messages sent in haste. She avoided social media not out of disdain, but out of self-preservation, aware that constant feedback eroded reflection. When controversies swirled, she did not scroll through reactions or track narratives. She focused on what she could control: the integrity of her work, the health of her relationships, the steadiness of routine. This discipline, cultivated over decades, was not coldness. It was care. There were also gestures of quiet generosity that rarely made headlines. Younger actors spoke of unexpected notes sent after performances, offering encouragement without instruction. Crew members remembered her learning names and noticing absences, asking about families without probing. These actions were not calculated displays of kindness. They were extensions of empathy practiced without audience. In a culture obsessed with visibility, she seemed almost determined to let her best qualities remain unseen. Her marriage, long regarded as one of Hollywood's most stable, followed a similar pattern of privacy. She did not present it as an ideal or a brand. It existed as a partnership built on mutual respect and acceptance of imperfection. When separation eventually occurred, it was handled with the same restraint that had defined their union. No statements crafted for sympathy. No narratives shaped for redemption. Just a quiet acknowledgement that relationships, like lives, evolve beyond original intentions. This acceptance of change without spectacle was perhaps one of her most difficult lessons, learned not from theory, but from lived experience. In moments of reflection, she reportedly questioned the mythology that had grown around her, the idea that she represented some unassailable standard. That image, she understood, was as limiting as it was flattering. It left no room for uncertainty, for error, for growth. Privately, she rejected it, reminding herself that she was still learning, still responding, still capable of misjudgment. This humility was not performative. It was rooted in an awareness that complexity was not something to overcome, but something to inhabit. Even her approach to aging reflected this philosophy. She did not frame it as defiance or triumph. She treated it as reality, something to observe and integrate rather than resist. Roles were chosen not to disguise time, but to explore it, to give voice to women whose stories were rarely centered. In doing so, she extended empathy not only outward, but inward, allowing herself to change without apology. These quieter stories reveal a woman less concerned with maintaining an image than with preserving a capacity to feel. She did not seek to erase pain or controversy, nor did she allow them to define her. Instead, she folded them into a larger understanding of what it meant to live attentively. Each small choice, each act of restraint, contributed to a life that resisted simplification. While public narratives oscillated between reverence and critique, her private world remained grounded in intention. What emerges from these hidden moments is not a saint or a symbol, but a person deeply aware of her own fragility and determined to protect it. She understood that survival did not require hardness, only boundaries. That endurance did not demand silence, only discernment. And that legacy, if it meant anything at all, was built not through declarations, but through consistency. These unseen decisions, repeated over years, formed the true scaffolding of her life, supporting a career that could withstand scrutiny precisely because it was anchored in something far quieter and far more human. As the years accumulated and the intensity of public scrutiny slowly receded into something more ambient, Meryl Streep entered a phase of reflection that was neither nostalgic nor defensive. It was measured, deliberate, and quietly philosophical. By this point, the question was no longer what she had achieved, but what her long passage through art, loss, controversy, and endurance had come to mean. Legacy, for her, was not a monument to be admired, but a set of values tested repeatedly under pressure. What survived those tests mattered more than accolades ever could. Her career had become a living archive of contradictions. Immense success coexisted with personal grief. Moral authority existed alongside public doubt. Technical mastery was paired with emotional vulnerability. Rather than attempting to resolve these tensions, she allowed them to remain visible, trusting that truth rarely arrives in clean conclusions. In doing so, she reframed what artistic greatness could look like in later life. Not dominance, not reinvention for spectacle, but relevance grounded in depth. One of the most enduring aspects of her legacy is the way she expanded the emotional vocabulary available to women on screen. Long after the industry suggested that complexity had an expiration date, she continued to embody characters shaped by age, regret, resilience, and quiet defiance. These women were not softened to be palatable, nor hardened to be impressive. They were contradictory, flawed, and alive. Through them, she challenged a system that preferred youth to wisdom and simplicity to nuance. Each role functioned as a quiet argument against erasure. Equally significant was her refusal to frame endurance as heroism. She did not present herself as having conquered hardship, but as having learned to live with it. This distinction mattered. It resisted the cultural impulse to package suffering into inspirational narratives and instead honored the ongoing nature of grief and doubt. By continuing to work without romanticizing pain, she offered a more honest model of resilience, one grounded in persistence rather than triumph. Her influence extended beyond performance into the ethics of practice. Younger actors often cited her not just for skill, but for professionalism, preparation, and respect for collaboration. She modeled a way of working that valued listening as much as expression, restraint as much as intensity. In an industry increasingly driven by visibility and speed, this approach stood as a counterpoint, reminding others that longevity depended on sustainability, not constant exposure. The controversies that once threatened to define her became, over time, part of a broader cultural reckoning rather than singular judgments. History began to contextualize them within systems larger than any one individual. This did not absolve responsibility, nor did it assign guilt retroactively. Instead, it highlighted the limitations of moral clarity in environments built on power imbalance and silence. Streep's experience became instructive not because it offered answers, but because it exposed the complexity of asking the right questions. What does accountability look like without omniscience? How does one act ethically inside structures designed to obscure harm? These were not questions she resolved publicly, but they shaped the way her story was ultimately understood. As she aged, her relationship to recognition evolved. Awards became acknowledgments rather than destinations. Records are noted, then set aside. She did not chase relevance, yet relevance followed because her work continued to engage with essential human concerns. Time did not diminish her presence. It clarified it. The authority she carried was no longer derived from prestige alone, but from consistency, from a visible commitment to craft that did not waver under shifting cultural winds. There was also a noticeable softening in how she engaged with the idea of limitation. Where earlier years emphasized discipline and control, later work embraced vulnerability without fear of diminishment. She allowed herself to be less composed, less polished, more openly human. This was not a surrender of standards, but an evolution of them. It reflected a deeper trust in the audience's capacity to meet her where she stood, without the armor of perfection. In private reflection, she reportedly resisted the language of legacy altogether. The word suggested finality, and she had never believed that growth ended neatly. Instead, she spoke of responsibility to the work, to the stories chosen, and to the people affected by them. This sense of responsibility extended beyond performance into the quiet acknowledgement that influence, once earned, carried obligation. To remain thoughtful, to remain engaged, to remain open to correction. What ultimately emerges from this phase of her life is not a portrait of closure, but of integration. Past and present, praise and critique, success and sorrow exist in conversation rather than opposition. She did not attempt to curate a flawless narrative. She allowed the contradictions to stand, trusting that a life honestly lived could withstand scrutiny without needing to be simplified. Her legacy, then, is less about dominance within an industry and more about expansion of what that industry considers possible. She demonstrated that a career could be long without becoming stagnant, respected without becoming untouchable, and influential without becoming rigid. She showed that empathy could be practiced as a discipline, not merely performed, and that silence, when chosen thoughtfully, could coexist with integrity. In the end, her story suggests that meaning is not derived from avoiding fracture, but from learning how to hold it without breaking. The value of her work lies not only in what it achieved, but in how it endured, adapting without surrender, aging without retreat, and remaining porous to experience even when experience was painful. This is the quieter inheritance she leaves behind, one that does not demand reverence, only attention. As the long arc of Meryl Streep's life and work settles into its present shape, what remains is not a sense of conclusion, but of continuation marked by restraint and quiet intention. She never framed her story as one of arrival, and even now, in the later years of her career, she resists the language of farewell. The world may look at her resume and see completion, but she has always understood life as something unfinished, a sequence of moments that has to be met rather than summarized. This refusal to declare an ending is perhaps the most revealing aspect of her character, a final affirmation that identity is not fixed by achievement or age, but sustained through attention and choice. The tragedies that have threaded through her life did not harden her into cynicism, nor did they soften her into sentimentality. Instead, they shaped a sensibility attuned to nuance, to the spaces between certainty and doubt, where most human experience actually lives. Loss taught her that permanence is an illusion. Fame taught her that approval is conditional. Controversy taught her that moral clarity is often demanded faster than it can be formed. Rather than resolving these lessons into a singular philosophy, she allowed them to coexist, informing how she moved through the world with caution, empathy, and an enduring sense of responsibility. In her later work, there is a noticeable shift away from assertion and toward observation. Characters are no longer vehicles for transformation alone, but mirrors held up to systems, relationships, and generational change. She appears not to command attention, but to invite it, trusting that presence need not be forceful to be felt. This subtle recalibration reflects a deeper understanding of power, one that recognizes influence not as volume, but as persistence. She does not demand that audiences follow her. She assumes they will, if the story is worth telling. Away from the screen, her life has narrowed rather than expanded, not as a retreat, but as a refinement. She chooses fewer appearances, fewer explanations, fewer concessions to spectacle. Family occupies the foreground, not as a shield against scrutiny, but as a source of continuity beyond it. Time is spent not curating an image, but sustaining relationships and routines that have nothing to do with legacy. In this simplicity lies a quiet defiance of a culture that equates relevance with constant exposure. Her relationship with the public remains respectful but distant, shaped by an understanding that familiarity can be both gift and burden. She offers gratitude without intimacy, openness without confession. This balance has often been misunderstood, yet it is consistent with a life spent protecting the inner space required for honest work. She knows that not every question deserves an answer, and not every silence signifies evasion. Sometimes it signifies care. As conversations about art, accountability, and influence continue to evolve, her story occupies a complex place within them. She is neither exempt from critique nor reducible to it. Instead, She stands as an example of what it means to remain engaged while accepting imperfection. The moral absolutism that once sought to categorize her has softened with time, replaced by a broader recognition that individuals operate within systems that shape behavior as much as intention does. This contextual understanding does not erase responsibility, but it reframes it as an ongoing process rather than a final judgment. What ultimately lingers is not a list of roles or records, but a particular way of being present in the world. She listened when listening was harder than speaking. She persisted when withdrawal would have been easier. She adapted without erasing herself. These qualities are not dramatic, but they are durable, and durability, more than brilliance, is what sustains a life in the public eye across decades. There is a quiet courage in continuing without spectacle, in choosing work that resonates rather than dazzles, in allowing complexity to remain unresolved. She has shown that it is possible to age without retreating, to evolve without abandoning discipline, and to remain curious without chasing validation. This approach does not promise immunity from pain or misunderstanding. It simply offers a way to keep moving with integrity intact. As her story continues, it does so without the urgency of proving anything further. The question is no longer whether she matters, but how her presence reshapes the spaces she enters. Each appearance carries the weight of experience, not as burden, but as texture. She does not erase the past, nor does she dwell within it. She carries it forward, allowing it to inform choices that are quieter, more selective, and more deliberate. In the end, her journey suggests that meaning is not something bestowed by applause or withdrawn by controversy. It is something constructed slowly, through repeated acts of attention, restraint, and care. A life does not need to be free of fracture to be whole. It needs only the willingness to remain open, to keep listening, and to continue telling stories that ask something of both the teller and the listener. And so her presence endures, not as a monument to perfection, but as a testament to endurance shaped by empathy. She stands not above the world that watches her, but within it, still working, still choosing, still listening. The tragedy that once seemed overwhelming has not defined her. It has deepened her, leaving behind not closure, but an invitation to look more closely at what it means to live fully, even when certainty is impossible.